Hey there, friend. Welcome back to another journey into the lands between. Tonight we're settling in with perhaps the most important story in all of Elden Ring. A tale about a witch with 4 arms and a plan that would reshape reality itself. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment and tell me what corner of the world you're resting in tonight. It's always comforting to know who else is out there, drifting off to these stories with me. Now, get comfortable, pull your blankets close, let the world outside fade away. Because tonight's story is about Ranni the Witch, and understanding her means understanding everything that happened in the lands between. Every broken castle, every wandering tarnished, every shattered dream. They all trace back to one cold winter night when a princess decided that freedom was worth any price. You see, when people talk about the villains of Elden Ring, they often point to obvious monsters. Mohg, the Lord of Blood, with his twisted dynasty built on kidnapping and corruption. Rykard, who fed himself to a serpent in pursuit of power. The frenzied flame, which wants to burn everything to ash and return the world to primordial chaos. These are easy to recognize as threats, as forces of destruction that must be stopped. But Ranni is different. Ranni is complicated. She speaks in riddles and poetry, appears as a beautiful doll with flowing blue hair and an enormous witch's hat, offers you gifts and calls you friend. She seems to want to help you, to guide you toward a better world. And yet, if you trace the threads of causality backward through the tangled web of Elden Ring's history, you find that Ranni is responsible for almost everything that went wrong. The shattering, the war between demigods that tore the lands between apart, the death of Godwyn the Golden, and the spread of those who live in death, the breaking of the Golden Order and the chaos that followed. Ranni set all of it in motion. She pulled the first thread that unravelled the tapestry, struck the first blow that brought down an empire, and she did it all deliberately, with full knowledge of what would happen, because she believed it was necessary. Tonight, we're going to explore her complete story. From her birth as a princess of the Carian royal family to the night of black knives that changed everything, from her centuries of hiding and planning to her ultimate goal of freeing the world from the influence of gods. We'll meet her faithful shadow Blaidd, whose loyalty was both his greatest strength and his tragic doom. We'll see how she manipulated events across decades, pulling strings and arranging circumstances with the precision of a master chess player. This is a story about freedom and control, about the cost of rebellion, about whether noble ends can justify terrible means. It's a story about a character who commits what might be the greatest act of terrorism in the lands between's history, yet genuinely believes she's saving the world. Whether she's right or wrong, whether she's a hero or a villain, well, that's something you'll have to decide for yourself. So settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let me tell you the story of Ranni the Witch. The night that shattered everything, the princess of the Carians. Our story begins not with a witch in a doll's body, but with a young girl born into one of the most powerful families in the lands between. Ranni was a princess of the Carian royal family, and to understand her, we must first understand where she came from. The Carian royal family ruled over Liurnia of the Lakes, a vast region dominated by the Academy of Raya Lucaria, where the greatest sorcerers in the world gathered to study the mysteries of glintstone magic. At the head of this family sat Queen Rennala, the Queen of the Full Moon, a woman of extraordinary magical power who had discovered her own personal moon and bound her soul to it. Rennala was a master of lunar sorcery, and her power was such that she could stand as an equal to the forces of the Golden Order. When Radagon, the champion of the Golden Order, came to Liurnia to wage war against the Carian royal family, something unexpected happened. Instead of conquest, there was love. Radagon and Rennala married, their union representing a merging of the Golden Order and the Academy of Raya Lucaria. It was supposed to be the beginning of a golden age of cooperation between sorcery and faith, between the moon and the Erd Tree. From this union, 3 children were born. Radan, who would grow to become a mighty general, learning gravity magic so he could continue riding his beloved horse Leonard, even as his body grew to enormous size. Rykard, who would eventually feed himself to a great serpent in pursuit of immortal power, and Ranni, the youngest, who took after her mother in every way that mattered. Where her brothers inherited their father's red hair and martial prowess, Ranni was born with the gift of sorcery, a natural prodigy in the magical arts that were her mother's domain. Ranni grew up in a world of privilege and power. She studied under her mother, learning the secrets of lunar magic, discovering how to manipulate the forces of the moon and stars. Rennala guided young Ranni in her quest to discover her own personal moon, as was the tradition among the greatest Carian sorcerers. Unlike her mother's full moon, which was bright and illuminating, Ranni's moon was characterized by a cold and dark nature. It was a dark moon, an object of fear rather than wonder, and perhaps this should have been the first sign of what kind of person Ranni would become. Ranni also had another mentor during this time, a figure known only as the Snow Witch or the Snowy Crone. This mysterious figure taught Ranni cold sorceries, and most importantly, taught her to fear her dark moon. The Snow Witch would later become the model for the doll body that Ranni would inhabit, a puppet with 4 arms and pale blue skin, eternally young and eternally beautiful in a cold, distant way. But the idyllic childhood of Princess Ranni was not destined to last. Queen Marika the Eternal, the goddess who ruled over all the lands between as the vessel of the Elden Ring, decided that she wanted a new consort. Her current husband, Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, was banished to distant lands along with his followers who would become the Tarnished, and Marika chose Radagon to be her new partner, elevating him to the position of second Elden Lord. The command was absolute. Radagon left Rennala without warning, abandoning his wife and their 3 children to return to Lendel and marry the goddess herself. This betrayal shattered Rennala's mind. The proud queen of the full moon, who had stood as Marika's equal in power and station, was reduced to a broken woman clutching a magical amber egg and singing lullabies to it in the ruins of her academy. She would never recover, spending the rest of her existence in that library, lost in memories of a love that had been torn away from her. For Ranni and her brothers, however, this abandonment came with an unexpected benefit. As the children of an Elden Lord, they were now elevated to the status of demigods. They gained power, prestige, and a place among the most influential beings in the lands between. Radan would become Starscourge Radan, holding back the very stars with his gravity magic. Rykard would become Lord of Blasphemy, ruler of Volcano Manor, and Ranni would be identified as something even more special. The two fingers, those strange entities that served as envoys of the greater will, chose Ranni as an Empyrean. This was an incredibly rare designation. Empyreans were beings who had the potential to become gods in the truest sense, to succeed Queen Marika as the vessel of the Elden Ring and reshape the fundamental laws of reality. There were only a handful of Empyreans in all of existence. Marika herself, of course, Ranni's half-siblings Malenia and Michaela, the cursed twins born from Marika's union with herself, and now Ranni, the young princess who had discovered a dark moon instead of a bright one. Being chosen as an Empyrean meant that Ranni was given a shadow, a guardian beast created specifically to protect her and ensure she fulfilled her destiny. This shadow was Blaidd, a being that was half man and half wolf, a towering warrior with lupine features and unshakable loyalty. Blaidd was approved by Queen Rennala despite her broken state, and he was raised as Ranni's stepbrother. From childhood, they played together, grew together, and formed a bond that seemed unbreakable. But there was something Ranni didn't know, something even Blaidd himself didn't understand. The shadows were not just protectors, they were fail-safes. If an Empyrean ever chose to betray the greater will, to deny the destiny that had been laid out for them, their shadow would slowly descend into madness. It was a built-in insurance policy, a way to ensure that no Empyrean could ever truly be free. The shadow would either bring their charge back into line, or would pose such a threat that the wayward Empyrean would have to destroy their most loyal companion. This was the world that Princess Ranni inherited, a world where gods and monsters fought for control of reality, where her mother was broken by betrayal, where her father had abandoned her for power, where she herself was marked as a potential vessel for forces she had never asked to serve. She was an Empyrean, which meant she was special, but it also meant she was a pawn in a cosmic game, a piece to be moved around a board by entities that saw mortals as tools rather than people. Ranni looked at this world and decided she wanted no part of it. She looked at the greater will and its plans for her and chose rebellion instead. But rebellion would require careful planning, absolute secrecy, and a willingness to do things that would horrify most people. It would require stealing something that had been sealed away for the protection of all civilization. It would require murder on a scale that would shake the foundations of the world. It would require sacrificing her own body and living as something that was no longer quite human. And Ranni was willing to do all of it, because freedom, true freedom, was worth any price. Even if that price was paid in blood and chaos, even if it meant becoming the catalyst for a war that would consume countless lives, even if it meant that history would remember her as the one who brought down the Golden Age and plunged the world into darkness. The young princess who had played with her wolf brother beneath the Carian moon was gone. In her place was something colder, something more calculating, something that had looked into the darkness of her own moon and decided to embrace it fully. The witch was being born, and the world would never be the same. The shadow and the witch. Before we can understand what Ranni did and why it matters, we need to talk about Blaidd, because his story is intertwined with hers in ways that are both beautiful and heartbreaking, and because understanding their relationship helps us understand the weight of the choices Ranni made. Blaidd was not born in the traditional sense. He was created by the Two Fingers specifically to serve Ranni when she was chosen as an Empyrean. Shadows were beastly warriors, beings of immense power and loyalty, designed to be perfect guardians. In all of Elden Ring's history, we know of only two shadows. One was Malekith, the Black Blade, who served Queen Marika and was tasked with guarding the Rune of Death. The other was Blaidd, who served Ranni and was tasked with ensuring she fulfilled her divine destiny. The name Blaidd is Welsh for wolf, and everything about him embodied that heritage. He was a towering figure, standing head and shoulders above most men, with the head of a black wolf and a body that was muscular and powerful. He wore the armour of a Carian knight, decorated with lunar motifs that symbolised his connection to Ranni and the pride of the moon. In his hands he wielded the royal greatsword, a massive blade decorated in the royal Carian style. But Blaidd was not a simple beast. He could speak, think, and feel emotions as deeply as any human. He was intelligent, strategic, and capable of complex thought. He had friends, allies, and a sense of honour that defined his every action. And more than anything else, he loved Ranni. Not in a romantic sense necessarily, though their relationship was certainly deep and profound, but in the way that a brother loves a sister, in the way that a loyal protector loves the one they've sworn to guard with their life. Queen Rennala, even in her grief over Radagon's abandonment, recognised the purity of Blaidd's devotion. She approved of him and welcomed him into the family as Ranni's stepbrother. From the time they were young, Blaidd and Ranni were inseparable. They played together in the gardens of Carian Manor, explored the ruins scattered throughout Liurnia, trained together in the arts of combat and magic. Blaidd watched over Ranni with a protective instinct that was both programmed into his very being and genuinely heartfelt. As they grew, their bond only deepened. Blaidd became Ranni's unwavering blade, her constant companion, the one person she could trust absolutely. The wolf was the beast of the Carian royal covenant, and he irrefutably symbolised the moon's pride. Where Ranni went, Blaidd followed. When Ranni needed protection, Blaidd provided it without question. When Ranni needed counsel, Blaidd offered it with the wisdom of someone who knew her better than anyone else in the world. But there were others in Ranni's inner circle as well, each playing their own role in her life and in the plans she would eventually set in motion. There was War Counselor Iji, a massive troll who served as blacksmith and advisor to the Carian royal family. Iji had known Ranni since she was a child and had been friends with Blaidd for just as long. He was loyal, wise, and deeply committed to ensuring Ranni's safety, even if it meant making decisions she might not approve of. His forge was located on the road to Carian Manor, and he spent his days crafting weapons and armour while keeping watch over the approaches to Ranni's domain. Then there was Preceptor Seluvis, a sorcerer of the Academy of Raya Lucaria, who claimed to serve Ranni but whose true loyalties were always questionable. Seluvis was arrogant, manipulative, and obsessed with creating puppet servants through dark magic. He lived in his own tower in the Three Sisters, the trio of tall structures that overlooked Carian Manor, and he spent his time conducting experiments that were as disturbing as they were effective. Ranni kept him around because he was useful, but there was never any love lost between them. These were Ranni's companions, the people who would help her carry out her plans when the time came. But of all of them, Blaidd was the one she trusted most, the one whose loyalty she could count on absolutely, and that trust was about to be put to the ultimate test. because at some point Ranni learned the truth. Perhaps through her studies of ancient texts, perhaps through conversations with her mother before Renala's mind completely shattered, perhaps through her own investigations into the nature of shadows and their purpose. However she discovered it, Ranni learned that Blaidd was not just her protector, he was her leash. The shadows had been created with a failsafe built into their very essence. If an Empyrean chose to deny their destiny, to turn away from the path the greater will had laid out for them, their shadow would slowly be driven mad. It was an insidious safeguard, one that turned loyalty into a weapon. The very devotion that made shadows such perfect guardians would become a curse, forcing them to either turn on their charge or lose their mind entirely in the struggle to remain faithful. Imagine learning that about someone you loved. Imagine discovering that your brother, your best friend, your most trusted companion had been designed from the beginning to be your jailer. That if you ever tried to break free from the destiny others had chosen for you, the person you cared about most would be destroyed by forces beyond anyone's control. It wasn't Blaidd's fault. He hadn't chosen this. He was as much a victim of the greater will's manipulation as Ranni was. But that didn't change the terrible reality of what would happen if Ranni chose the path of rebellion. And yet, somehow, Ranni and Blaidd both knew. Perhaps she told him what she had discovered. Perhaps he had always suspected there was something more to his creation than simple loyalty. But both of them understood what Ranni's plans would mean for Blaidd in the end. And in defiance of everything, in defiance of his very nature and the fate he was born to, Blaidd swore an oath to serve no master but Ranni. The description of his weapon, the royal greatsword, tells us about this moment. It says that in defiance of the fate he was born to, Blaidd swore to serve no master but Ranni, and as proof, the sword was imbued with cold magic at the moment the oath was sworn. Blaidd chose his sister over his programming. He chose love over destiny. He knew what it would cost him, knew that he was essentially agreeing to his own eventual destruction, and he did it anyway because Ranni's freedom was more important than his survival. This is what makes their relationship so tragic. It wasn't just loyalty, it was conscious sacrifice. Blaidd went into Ranni's rebellion with his eyes open, knowing that every step they took toward freeing her from the greater will was also a step toward his own madness and death. And he did it willingly, gladly, because he believed in her cause and because he loved her more than he loved his own life. The relationship between the witch and her wolf is one of the most beautiful things in all of Elden Ring's lore, and also one of the saddest. It's a story about love that transcends programming, about loyalty that persists even in the face of inevitable doom, about the bonds between beings who choose each other over and over again despite knowing how the story will end. War Counselor Iji understood this too. He watched Blaidd and Ranni throughout their youth, saw how deeply they cared for each other, and knew what was coming. Years later, when events began to accelerate, and Blaidd started showing signs of the madness that had always been waiting for him, Iji would try desperately to protect them both. He would make decisions that he thought were merciful, that he hoped would spare Blaidd from the worst of his fate. But in the end, there was no way to save the wolf from what he had always been designed to become. For now, though, in those early days when Ranni was still forming her plans, Blaidd stood at her side as he always had. The princess and her shadow, the witch and her wolf, bound together by bonds of family and choice and tragic destiny. They were preparing for something that would shake the foundations of the world, and they were doing it together, knowing that it would ultimately tear them apart. Ranni had her companions. She had her knowledge of magic and the secret ways of the world. She had her determination to be free. But what she didn't yet have was the weapon she would need to strike at the heart of the Golden Order. What she needed was something that had been sealed away by Queen Marika herself, something so dangerous that its very existence threatened the stability of civilization. She needed death itself, and she was willing to steal it. The Knight of Black Knives. Planning. To understand the magnitude of what Ranni was planning, you need to understand what death meant in the lands between, or rather, what it didn't mean, because under the Golden Order, death had been abolished. Before Queen Marika's ascension to godhood, death was a natural part of existence. All things lived, and all things died, and this cycle was governed by the rune of death, also called destined death. It was one of the fundamental forces of reality, as essential to the order of things as gravity or time. But when Marika took control of the Elden Ring and began to shape the world according to her vision, one of the first things she did was remove the rune of death from the ring. Without the rune of death embedded in the Elden Ring, nothing in the lands between could truly die. Oh, bodies could be killed, certainly. Swords could pierce flesh. Magic could burn and destroy. Poison could corrupt and consume. But the souls of those who fell would be drawn back to the Erd Tree, absorbed into its roots, and eventually reborn. It was a form of immortality, though not necessarily a pleasant one. You could experience death countless times, feel the pain and terror of your ending over and over, but you would always return. The Erd Tree would pull you back, recycle you, and spit you out to live and die and live again in an endless cycle. For the demigods and gods, this immortality was even more absolute. They couldn't be killed at all. Their bodies could be wounded, even grievously so, but they would recover. They would persist, eternal and unchanging, impossible to permanently remove from the world. This was how the Golden Order maintained its stability. The ruling class couldn't be overthrown through violence because violence couldn't actually kill them. Rebellion was pointless when the gods you were rebelling against would simply shrug off your most devastating attacks and continue ruling as they always had. Marika had sealed the rune of death inside her shadow, Malekith the Black Blaidd. Malekith was perhaps the most dangerous warrior in all the lands between, a beast of incredible power who had been given the singular task of guarding death itself and ensuring that no one could ever steal it. He kept it sealed within his own body, bound to his flesh through magic that made it nearly impossible to extract. Malekith was absolutely loyal to Marika, devoted to his duty with a fervour that bordered on obsession. He would die before he let anyone take the rune of death from him. But Ranni was patient, she was intelligent, and she understood that even the most vigilant guardian had weaknesses, that even the secure prison had flaws. She studied the problem for years, researching ancient texts, gathering information, looking for any hint of how she might accomplish the impossible. And somewhere in her research, Ranni discovered the Black Knife Assassins. These were no ordinary killers. They were elite warriors from the Eternal Cities, underground civilizations that had existed long before the Golden Order and had their own traditions and powers. The Black Knife assassins were all women, all new men, a race that was said to have originated from outside the lands between entirely. They were aliens or celestial beings, depending on which legends you believed, and they possessed abilities that made them perfect for the task Ranni had in mind. What made this particularly interesting was that Queen Marika herself was rumoured to be of Numen blood. The Black Knife assassins shared a heritage with the goddess they would be hired to strike against. Whether this was coincidence or something more intentional, some hidden connection that made them specifically suited for the job, we may never know. But Ranni identified them as the tool she needed. The plan was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Ranni would somehow steal a fragment of the Rune of Death from Malekith. Not all of it, because taking everything would be impossible even for her, but a piece, a splinter of that fundamental power. She would then perform a fearsome ritual to imbue the Black Knife assassin's weapons with this stolen fragment, creating daggers that could do what nothing else in the lands between could do anymore. They could kill permanently. They could slay the soul itself, not just the body. They could impose true death on beings that had been made immortal. But Ranni's plan had an additional layer of complexity. She didn't just want to kill someone, she wanted to kill herself. Or more precisely, she wanted to kill her body while preserving her soul. Being an Empyrean meant being bound to the greater will, meant having your destiny dictated by forces you couldn't control, meant serving as a vessel for the desires of an outer god. Ranni wanted to escape that fate. She wanted to be free. The solution she devised was brilliant and horrifying in equal measure. The curse mark of death, the physical manifestation of the Rune of Death's power when it killed someone, was supposed to form a complete circle. But if two beings died at exactly the same moment, using the same fragment of the Rune of Death, the curse mark would split into two half-wheels. One person would die in body but preserve their soul. The other would die in soul but preserve their body. Ranni planned to be the one who died in body. She would transfer her soul into a doll modelled after her mentor, the Snow Witch, becoming something that was no longer flesh and blood but was still conscious, still thinking, still capable of acting in the world. Without her Empyrean body, the Two Fingers would lose their hold on her. She could escape her destiny, break free from the chains that bound all Empyreans to serve the greater will. But this meant someone else had to die in soul. Someone had to suffer the opposite fate, becoming a soulless body that would persist in a state of living death. Ranni needed a sacrifice, someone whose death would balance her own, whose soul would be destroyed so that hers could be freed. And she chose Godwyn the Golden. Godwyn was the firstborn son of Queen Marika and Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. He was the perfect demigod in many ways, beautiful and golden-haired, mighty in battle, beloved by his people. He had defeated the ancient dragon Fortisax in single combat, earning the dragon's respect and friendship, leading to the establishment of the dragon cult in Lanedale. He was called the Prince of Gold, the shining example of everything the Golden Order represented. He was also Ranni's stepbrother. When Radagon left Rennala to marry Marika, he brought his children into Marika's extended family. Godwyn and Ranni were connected by these complicated family ties, by the marriages and betrayals and political machinations that defined the divine families of the lands between. There is even evidence that Godwyn had a close relationship with Ranni's half-siblings Melina and Michaela. A statue in the Halig tree shows an adult figure hugging the twin Empyreans, and this is believed to be Godwyn. So when Ranni chose Godwyn as the one who would die in soul so that she could die in body, she wasn't just picking a random target. She was choosing someone she knew, someone who was part of her family, someone who by all accounts was a genuinely good person who didn't deserve the fate she was about to inflict on him. This wasn't an impersonal strike against an enemy. This was fratricide, the murder of a brother to secure her own freedom. The ritual Ranni performed to imbue the Black Knife assassin's daggers with the power of the Rune of Death was described as fearsome. We don't know the exact details of what it required, what sacrifices it demanded, what dark magic she had to invoke to make it work. But we know it succeeded. The daggers became weapons capable of killing gods, of severing souls from bodies, of imposing permanent death on beings that were supposed to be immortal. With her weapons prepared and her assassins ready, Ranni set the stage for the event that would change everything. She picked the night carefully, waiting for conditions to be just right. A cold winter night, fog rolling through the streets of Lendel, the capital shrouded in mist and shadow. The perfect night for murder. Everything was ready. The assassins knew their targets. The daggers were imbued with stolen death. Ranni had made peace with what she was about to do, or at least had convinced herself that the ends justified the means, that freedom was worth the blood it would cost. The night of black knives was about to begin, and after it was over, nothing in the lands between would ever be the same again. The night that shattered everything. On a night of wintry fog, while the capital slept beneath clouds of mist, the Black Knife assassins struck. They moved like shadows through the streets of Lindell, their footsteps silent, their forms barely visible even when you looked directly at them. They wore armor that had been forged to make no sound, enchanted with magic that muffled their movements and made them nearly impossible to detect. Over this armor, they wore cowls that concealed their forms in veils of invisibility, making them appear as nothing more than distortions in the air, like heat shimmer or a trick of the eyes. These were elite killers, the best of the best, warriors who had trained for a lifetime in the arts of assassination. And they were all women, all new men, all bound by the contract they had signed with the mysterious princess who had hired them for this impossible task. They carried daggers that glowed with a faint, sickly light, weapons that felt wrong to hold, that seemed to drink in warmth and life, that pulsed with a power that should never have existed in the world. The assassins had their primary target, Godwyn the Golden, the beloved prince, Marika's firstborn, the shining exemplar of everything good about the Golden Order. He was in Lendell that night, in the royal capital, surrounded by guards and protections, sleeping soundly in a palace that had never been breached by enemies. But the Black Knife assassins were not ordinary enemies. They slipped past sentries like ghosts, avoided magical wards with practiced ease, navigated the palace's defences as if they had been given detailed maps and timing schedules for every guard rotation, which perhaps they had. We know that Ranni had planned this for years. It's entirely possible that she had spent all that time gathering intelligence, bribing servants, learning every weakness in Lendell's security. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was a carefully orchestrated operation executed with surgical precision. The assassins found Godwyn. We don't know the exact details of what happened next. Did they wake him first? Did they let him know he was being killed, and why? Did he fight back, or was he taken so completely by surprise that he never had a chance to defend himself? The texts don't tell us. All we know is what happened. They restrained him. Multiple assassins working together, overwhelming even a demigod through numbers and surprise, and the advantage of weapons that could actually harm him. They carved a ritual circle into his back, a precise geometric pattern that would serve as the anchor point for the curse mark of death. And then, at the precise moment that had been calculated, they drove their black knives into his flesh and carved the rune of death into his very being. Godwyn died, not just in body, but in soul. The curse mark of death that formed on his back was only half a circle, half a wheel missing its other piece. His soul was severed completely, destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery or resurrection. What the Erdtree reclaims after death is the soul, drawing it back into its roots to be eventually reborn. But Godwyn's soul was simply gone, obliterated by the power of destined death. His body, however, remained. It didn't decay in the normal way. It didn't rot or corrupt or crumble to dust. Instead, it began to transform into something terrible and wrong. Roots grew from his corpse, strange growths that looked like a horrible parody of plant life, spreading death and corruption wherever they touched. His face became misshapen, bloated, covered in eyes that saw nothing and mouths that spoke only silence. His body sank deep beneath Leyndell, into the roots of the Erdtree itself, and from there it would spread its corruption throughout the lands between. This was the birth of those who live in death, the beginning of a plague that would create beings trapped between life and death, unable to truly die, but no longer truly alive. Skeletons would animate with a hideous parody of life, crawling from graves and attacking the living. Spirits would linger in the world, unable to move on, trapped in an eternal twilight existence. All of this traced back to Godwyn's death, to the moment when his soulless body began spreading its curse through the roots of the Erdtree. But the Night of Black Knives didn't end with Godwyn. That was just the primary assassination. The Black Knife assassins had other targets, other demigods scattered throughout the lands between, who needed to die to ensure the success of Ranni's plan. We don't know exactly who else they killed that night, but we know there were multiple deaths, multiple strikes across different locations. The fog that night wasn't just in Leyndell, it covered the entire lands between, providing cover for murders that happened simultaneously across vast distances. And at the same moment that Godwyn died in soul, Ranni died in body. She had prepared for this moment, had set up everything she needed for her escape. The doll body modelled after the Snow Witch was ready, waiting to receive her soul. The magic that would perform the transfer was in place, and when the assassin struck Godwyn, when his soul was being severed by the daggers imbued with destined death, Ranni performed her own ritual. She killed her own body. Whether she used one of the black knives herself, whether she had one of her companions do it, whether she used some other method entirely, we don't know. But she imposed death upon herself at precisely the calculated moment, and because she was dying at the same time as Godwyn using the same fragment of the Rune of Death, The curse mark split as she had planned. Godwyn got the half that killed his soul. Ranni got the half that killed her body. Her Empyrean flesh died, the beautiful physical form that had marked her as a vessel for the greater will. But her soul survived, fled into the doll body, found refuge in the artificial form that looked like her old mentor. She opened her eyes in a new body with 4 arms and pale blue skin, still conscious, still thinking, still herself in all the ways that mattered. But she was no longer an Empyrean. She was no longer bound to serve the greater will. She was free, or at least she believed she was free. Because what Ranni didn't realize, what she couldn't have known, was that the consequences of what she had done would echo far beyond her personal liberation. The death of Godwyn the Golden broke Queen Marika's heart. Imagine it. Your firstborn son, the child you had raised and nurtured, the one who embodied all your hopes for what the Golden Order could be, murdered in his sleep by assassins who left his body but took his soul. Godwyn was supposed to be immortal, supposed to be safe from death itself because death had been sealed away. And yet he was gone, truly and permanently gone, destroyed by a power that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone. Marika's grief was absolute. It consumed her utterly, and in her despair and rage she did something that would doom the entire world. She took the hammer that had been used to forge the Elden Ring, the divine tool that had shaped the laws of reality, and she turned it against the ring itself. Queen Marika the Eternal shattered the Elden Ring. She broke it into pieces, scattered its great runes across the lands between, destroyed the very foundation of the order she had spent centuries building. We don't know exactly why she did this. Was it pure grief? A moment of madness brought on by unbearable loss? Was it rage at the greater will for failing to protect her son? Was it some deeper plan, some purpose we still don't understand? The texts don't tell us her motivations, they only tell us what she did. And with the shattering of the Elden Ring, war came to the lands between. The demigods, Marika's other children and stepchildren, each claimed fragments of the ring for themselves. These fragments were called Great Runes, and they granted immense power to whoever held them. But that power came with corruption, with madness, with an insatiable hunger for more. Radahn claimed a Great Rune and used it to enhance his already formidable strength, becoming a walking mountain of muscle and power. Rikard claimed a Great Rune and fed himself to a serpent, merging with it to become the god-devouring serpent. Mog claimed a Great Rune and founded his dynasty of blood. Morgott claimed a Great Rune and defended Lindell even as he was branded a curse. Malenia claimed a Great Rune but never used it, too devoted to her brother Miquella to care about power for its own sake. These demigods went to war with each other. Brother fought sister, half-siblings battled for supremacy. Alliances formed and broke and reformed in a dance of violence and betrayal that would last for what seemed like an eternity. Entire armies clashed. Regions were laid waste. Caelid became a rotting hellscape when Malenia unleashed her scarlet rot in desperation during her battle with Radahn. The lands between, which had been a golden paradise under the unified rule of the Golden Order, became a shattered wasteland where demigods fought endless wars over fragments of a broken ring. This was the shattering. This was the disaster that defined the current age of the lands between, the catastrophe that created the world that players encounter when they arrive as tarnished. and it all traced back to the Night of Black Knives, to Godwyn's death, to Ranni's decision that her freedom was worth any price. Think about the scale of suffering that Ranni's actions caused. Countless soldiers died in the wars between demigods. Entire populations were displaced or destroyed. The land between went from a world of order and stability to a world of chaos and violence. Yes, the Golden Order had been oppressive. Yes, it had persecuted those it deemed impure or unworthy. Yes, there were many problems with Marika's rule, but the shattering was worse. At least under the Golden Order there was peace. People could live their lives without worrying about being caught in the crossfire of wars between gods. Ranni had to have known this would happen. She was too intelligent, too strategic, too careful in her planning not to have anticipated the consequences. She knew that Godwyn's death would devastate Marika. She knew that breaking the first principle of the Golden Order, killing someone who was supposed to be unkillable, would shake the foundations of everything. She had to have understood that chaos would follow. And she did it anyway, because to Ranni, freedom was worth more than stability. Autonomy was worth more than peace. The right to choose your own destiny was worth more than the comfort and security of living under someone else's order, even if that order kept most people safe most of the time. This is what makes Ranni such a complicated character. She wasn't wrong that the Golden Order was oppressive, that being an Empyrean meant being a prisoner of forces beyond your control, that the greater will treated thinking beings as tools rather than people with their own agency. She had every right to want freedom, every right to rebel against a destiny she had never chosen. But the method she used to achieve that freedom and the consequences of her rebellion killed thousands of innocent people who had nothing to do with her struggle. Was it worth it? That's the question at the heart of Ranni's story, and it's one that doesn't have an easy answer. Different people will come to different conclusions based on their own values and priorities, but regardless of where you come down on the morality of her actions, you can't deny the magnitude of what she did. One night, one assassination, one escape from destiny, and the entire world burned. The Night of Black Knives earned its name. It was the night that everything changed, the moment when the Golden Age ended and the Age of Chaos began. And it was all orchestrated by a princess in a tower who wanted to be free. Before we continue with the rest of Ranni's story, I want to take a moment to thank you for listening. If you're enjoying this journey through Ranni's tale, through the complexities of her character and the weight of her choices, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. It helps other people discover these videos, helps them find a relaxing way to drift off while exploring these incredible stories. Let's continue the story, the aftermath, and the shattering. In the centuries following the Night of Black Knives, the lands between descended into chaos that would define an entire age. The world that had been unified under Queen Marika's Golden Order fractured into warring factions, each vying for power, each claiming pieces of what had been broken. Godwyn's death sent ripples through reality itself. His soulless body didn't simply decay. It transformed into something new and terrible, something that violated the natural order. Deep beneath Leyndell, in the roots of the Erd Tree itself, Godwyn's corpse became the Prince of Death. His face bloated and distorted, covered in eyes that saw nothing and mouths that spoke only silence. Strange growth spread from his body, root-like appendages that looked like a horrifying parody of plant life, spreading death and corruption wherever they touched. These deathroot growths didn't stay contained. They spread through the roots of the Erd tree, carried throughout the lands between by the very system that was supposed to bring life and renewal. Everywhere the deathroot touched, the dead began to rise. Not truly alive, but not properly dead either. They existed in a twilight state between life and death, animated by the curse that radiated from Godwyn's corrupted form. This was the birth of those who live in death. Skeletons crawled from their graves, their bones animated by forces they didn't understand, driven by instincts that belonged to lives they no longer remembered. Spirits lingered in the world, trapped between existence and oblivion, unable to move on to whatever came after death, but unable to fully remain either. They wandered, confused and suffering, caught in an eternal twilight that was neither living nor dying. The affliction spread rapidly. Tibia mariners, spectral figures piloting ghostly boats, appeared throughout the lands between, herding the dead and spreading the earth further. Death birds, creatures that had once been sacred symbols associated with death rites, became twisted and corrupted by exposure to Godwyn's influence. Entire regions became infested with the walking dead. Their populations transformed from living communities into hordes of shambling corpses that attacked anything warm and alive. The Golden Order had no answer for this. Death was supposed to have been sealed away. The rune of death was bound within Malekith, kept safe and inaccessible, ensuring that nothing in the lands between could truly die. But Godwyn's state wasn't death in the traditional sense. He was dead in soul but alive in body, and that impossible contradiction created a curse that the Golden Order's laws couldn't address. Marika's response to her son's murder was to shatter the Elden Ring itself. We don't know exactly what drove her to this. Was it grief so overwhelming that it destroyed her reason? Was it rage at the greater will for failing to protect Godwyn despite all the promises of immortality? Was it perhaps something more calculated, a deliberate act of rebellion against the cosmic forces that had used her as their vessel for so long? The texts don't tell us her motivations, only what she did. With a hammer that had been used to forge the Elden Ring, Marika broke it into pieces. The great runes, fragments of the ring that had governed the fundamental laws of reality, were scattered across the lands between. And with the ring shattered, its power to maintain order, to enforce the rules that kept civilization stable, was gone. The greater will responded by shattering Marika in turn. She was bound to the rune arc inside the Erd tree, suspended in a state between life and death, punishment for her betrayal of her divine purpose. But the damage was done. The ring was broken, and the age of stability was over. The demigods, Marika's children and stepchildren, immediately began fighting over the fragments. Each of them claimed great runes for themselves, and these fragments granted immense power to whoever held them. But they also brought corruption. The great runes weren't meant to be divided. They were pieces of a whole, and possessing just a fragment drove their bearers toward madness and conflict. Radahn claimed a great rune, and his power grew even more formidable than it had been. But the wars that followed his claiming of that power would eventually lead him to Caelid and his battle with Malenia, where he would be infected with scarlet rot and reduced to a mindless beast roaming a wasteland he had inadvertently helped create. Rykard claimed a great rune and became obsessed with the idea of immortal power. He fed himself to a great serpent at Mount Gelmir, merging with it to become the god-devouring serpent, a massive creature that devoured anyone who came near it in an endless hunger that could never be satisfied. Mog claimed a great rune and founded the Mogwyn dynasty, a cult dedicated to blood magic and dark rituals. He made contact with the Formless Mother, an outer god of blood and wounds, and began planning to create his own age with himself as god. His obsession with finding an Empyrean consort would eventually lead him to kidnap Michaela, though, as we've learned, that kidnapping was part of Michaela's own plans. Morgott claimed a great rune, but remained loyal to the Golden Order despite being an omen, despite having been imprisoned in the sewers beneath Lendel for the crime of being born with horns. He defended the capital against all comers, preventing any of his siblings from reaching the Erd Tree and claiming the power to become Elden Lord. His loyalty to a system that had rejected him was perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Shattering. Malenia claimed a great rune, but never used its power. She was devoted entirely to her brother Michaela, serving as his blade, his protector, his unwavering weapon against any who would threaten him. When Michaela was taken from the Allig Tree, she returned there after her disastrous battle with Radahn and waited, rotting but still loyal, still proclaiming herself the Blade of Michaela, even as both she and the tree died around her. And Ranni? Ranni claimed her great rune and then deliberately discarded it. She wanted no part of the power struggle between the demigods. She had already abandoned her Empyrean body, had already freed herself from the destiny the Greater Will had planned for her. The conflicts between her step-siblings meant nothing to her. She had her own plans, her own vision for what the world should become, and those plans required patience, secrecy, and time. The wars between the demigods raged for what seemed like an eternity. Armies clashed across the lands between. Entire regions were devastated. Caelid became a rotting hellscape when Malenia unleashed the full power of the Scarlet Rot in her desperate battle against Radahn. The Lake of Liurnia became a battlefield. Even the Altus Plateau, the high ground leading to Lendel, saw countless conflicts as various factions tried to reach the capital and claim the right to become Elden Lord. Countless soldiers died in these wars, entire families were wiped out. Communities that had thrived under the Golden Order's stability were destroyed by the chaos of the Shattering. The lands between, which had been a golden paradise of order and civilization, became a nightmarish wasteland where demigods fought endless wars and common people struggled just to survive. And through all of this, Ranni watched from her hiding places. She had set these events in motion with the Knight of Black Knives, with Godwyn's assassination, with her own escape from her Empyrean fate. The suffering that followed was a direct consequence of her actions. She had to have known this would happen, had to have understood that breaking the first principle of the Golden Order would lead to chaos and war. But to Ranni this was acceptable. The Golden Order needed to fall. The Greater Will needed to lose its grip on the lands between, and if that required plunging the world into war, if it required the deaths of thousands of innocent people who had nothing to do with the cosmic struggles between Empyreans and outer gods, then that was a price she was willing to pay. Not a price she would pay herself, mind you. Ranni wasn't going to suffer for her rebellion. She had found a way to escape the consequences of her actions, to hide away while the world burned, to wait in safety until the time was right to emerge and complete her plans. The suffering was for everyone else. The death toll was paid by common soldiers and civilians. The chaos and terror were experienced by people who had never asked to be part of Ranni's struggle for freedom. This is one of the most complicated aspects of Ranni's character. She wanted to free the world from the tyranny of the greater will, to create an age where people could live without the interference of gods. This was a noble goal. The greater will did treat people as tools rather than as beings with their own agency. The Golden Order was oppressive and cruel to those it deemed unworthy. Ranni's vision of freedom had genuine merit, but the method she chose to achieve that vision and the consequences she set in motion created suffering on a scale that dwarfed anything the Golden Order had inflicted. Yes, the Golden Order persecuted the Omen and the Misbegotten and the Albinorics. Yes, it maintained a strict hierarchy that kept certain groups in positions of power while casting others aside. But it also maintained peace. People could live their lives without worrying about demigods waging war in their backyards, without armies trampling their fields, without the walking dead rising from their graves to attack the living. After the shattering, all of that stability was gone, and while Ranni could argue that the chaos was temporary, that once her plans came to fruition she would create a better world, that argument rang hollow to the people who died in the wars she had started, to the families torn apart by the conflicts between demigods, to the communities destroyed by forces they couldn't comprehend and had never wanted to fight. Ranni had broken the world, and now she needed to remake it according to her vision. But first, she needed to wait. She needed to hide. She needed to let the pieces fall into place before she could make her next move. And she needed someone who could do what she couldn't do herself. Someone who could navigate the dangers of the lands between and retrieve the tools she would need to complete her grand design. She needed a tarnished. The doll and the plan. After the Night of Black Knives, after she had killed her Empyrean body and transferred her soul into the doll modelled after the Snow Witch, Ranni effectively disappeared from the world. She withdrew to her domain in Liurnia, to the tall towers called the Three Sisters that overlooked Carian Manor, and there she waited and planned while the world tore itself apart around her. The doll body she inhabited was a curious thing. It was constructed with 4 arms, pale blue skin that felt cold to the touch, and flowing blue hair that seemed to move with an ethereal wind even when the air was still. One eye was sealed shut by an azure sigil, a mark that had significance in the larger cosmology of the lands between, possibly connecting her to forces that rivaled the greater will itself. She wore the clothes of her old mentor, the Snow Witch, elegant white garments beneath a massive witch's hat that gave her an otherworldly fairy tale appearance. The puppet body wasn't as strong as her Empyrean form had been. She couldn't wield weapons effectively, couldn't engage in direct combat the way she might have before, but it served its purpose. It housed her consciousness, gave her a form she could use to interact with the world, and most importantly, it was not bound to the greater will. The 2 fingers had no claim on this artificial body. She was free in a way that no Empyrean had ever been free before. But freedom came with limitations. Ranni needed to accomplish certain tasks to complete her plan, to bring about the Age of Stars that she envisioned. And many of those tasks were beyond her capability in her current form. She needed someone who could fight who could traverse dangerous territories, who could retrieve artifacts from places even she couldn't easily reach. Someone who wasn't bound by the same constraints that limited her movement and actions. For centuries she waited. She studied ancient texts in the libraries of Carian Manor. She researched the history of the Eternal Cities, those underground civilizations that had existed long before the Golden Order and had their own traditions and powers. She learned about Nokron and Nokstella, about the Nox people who had been banished beneath the earth for their transgressions against the greater will. And she learned about an artifact they had created, a weapon of incredible power that existed in Nokron, the Finger Slayer Blaidd. A weapon said to have been born from a corpse, a blood-drenched fetish that was proof of the high treason committed by the Eternal City. This blade was capable of harming the greater will itself and its vassals. Specifically, it could kill the Two Fingers, those strange entities that served as envoys of the greater will that directed the fates of Empyreans and guided the Golden Order. Every Empyrean had their own set of Two Fingers, a pair of these bizarre beings that communicated the greater will's intentions and ensured the Empyrean followed the path laid out for them. Ranni still had her Two Fingers, even after abandoning her Empyrean body. They waited for her in a hidden location, still believing they could control her fate, still thinking they could force her to fulfill the destiny they had chosen for her. Ranni needed to kill her Two Fingers permanently. Only then would she be truly free from the greater will's influence, and to do that, she needed the Fingerslayer blade. But there was a problem. Nokron was inaccessible. The Eternal City had been banished underground by the greater will as punishment for the Nox people's transgressions, and the entrance had been sealed. No one had found a way into Nokron in living memory. The solution to this problem lay in the stars. The Nox people had worshipped the stars, had believed in a Lord of Night who would usher in an age of stars. Their civilization was intrinsically connected to celestial movements and cosmic forces. And Ranni realized that the way to Nokron would be revealed when the stars fell, when the celestial order was disrupted in just the right way. But there was an obstacle to this plan. The stars weren't moving. They had been held in place, frozen in the sky, prevented from falling or shifting by an immensely powerful force. That force was Starscourge Radan, Ranni's own brother, who had learned gravity magic and grown so powerful that he could literally hold back the stars themselves. Radan's reasons for doing this were complex. Some said he was holding back fate itself, preventing destinies from unfolding, keeping the cosmic order frozen because he believed that was his duty. Others suggested he was protecting the lands between from something dangerous that would arrive with the falling stars. Whatever his motivations, the result was clear. As long as Radan lived and maintained his power, the stars would not fall, and Nokron would remain inaccessible. So Ranni needed Radan dead, or at least she needed him weakened enough that his grip on the stars would fail. But Radan was the mightiest warrior among all the demigods. He had defeated countless enemies, held off entire armies, maintained his power even as the scarlet rot consumed his mind and body. No ordinary warrior could hope to defeat him. This is where Ranni's centuries of waiting became strategic. She knew that eventually the Tarnished would return. Queen Marika had banished Godfrey and his warriors long ago, stripping them of the grace of the Erd Tree and sending them to distant lands. But Marika had also promised that one day, when the time was right, Grace would call them back. The Tarnished would return to the lands between, driven by the guidance of Grace, empowered by their deaths and resurrections to become stronger with each attempt. Ranni couldn't know which Tarnished would be strong enough, capable enough, determined enough to accomplish what she needed. So she prepared to test them all. She would appear to them early in their journey, offer them gifts, gauge their potential. And when she found one who seemed capable of reaching the end of her quest, she would offer them the opportunity to serve her, to help her achieve her vision in exchange for rewards and knowledge. Her hideout at Carian Manor was perfect for this purpose. The manor was filled with dangers that would test any Tarnished who tried to reach it. The hand monsters that infested the grounds were horrifying creatures that could kill careless adventurers in seconds. The battle mages and sorcerers that defended the approaches were skilled and deadly. And at the top of the manor guarding the path to Ranni's rise was Loretta, Knight of the Halig Tree. Loretta had once served the Carian royal family but had abandoned that service when she learned about Miquella's Halig Tree. She had pledged herself to Miquella's cause, believing in his vision of a sanctuary for the persecuted. But before she could actually reach the Halig Tree, she served as the final guardian of Carian Manor, perhaps as a favour to Ranni, or perhaps simply because she was stationed there when everything fell apart. Any Tarnished who wanted to reach Ranni would first have to defeat Loretta, proving their combat prowess against one of the most skilled knights in the lands between. Beyond Carian Manor lay the Three Sisters, 3 tall towers connected by bridges and pathways. One was Ranni's Rise, where Ranni herself waited. One was Renna's Rise, sealed by magic that would only open at a specific point in Ranni's plan, and one was Seluvis's Rise, home to Preceptor Seluvis, the manipulative sorcerer who served Ranni while pursuing his own twisted agenda involving puppet creation and mind control. Ranni also had War Counselor Iji stationed on the road leading to Carian Manor. Iji was a massive troll who served as blacksmith and advisor, crafting weapons and armour while keeping watch over the approaches to Ranni's domain. Iji had known Ranni since she was young, had been friends with Blaidd for decades, and was absolutely devoted to ensuring Ranni's plans succeeded, even if it meant making difficult decisions that she might not approve of. This was Ranni's network, the resources she had gathered and maintained through centuries of hiding. It wasn't much compared to the armies and fortresses controlled by her step-siblings, but it was enough for her purposes. She didn't need to conquer territory or wage open war. She just needed to wait for the right Tarnished to appear, someone capable of accomplishing the tasks she couldn't do herself, someone who could be guided towards serving her ends even if they didn't fully understand what they were working toward. And eventually that Tarnished arrived. Whether it was destiny or coincidence or the machinations of forces beyond anyone's understanding, a Tarnished appeared in the lands between who had the potential to reach the end of Ranni's quest. Someone who could defeat Radahn, who could navigate Nokron, who could survive the challenges Ranni would set before them. Someone who could, perhaps without fully realizing it, help Ranni achieve everything she had been working toward for centuries. Ranni's first contact with this Tarnished came early in their journey. She appeared at the Church of Elay in Limgrave, a small ruin near the very beginning of the Lands Between's territories. She called herself Renna, using a false name, and offered the Tarnished a gift. the spirit-calling bell, an artifact that would allow them to summon spectral allies to aid them in battle. This gift wasn't random kindness, it was an investment. Ranni was testing this tarnished, seeing if they would accept help, if they would use the tools she provided, if they had the potential to become what she needed them to be. And she was establishing a relationship, creating a debt of gratitude that could be leveraged later when she revealed her true identity and offered them the chance to serve her directly. The Tarnished accepted the bell as Ranni had hoped they would, and from that point forward she watched their progress with interest, waiting for them to become strong enough to serve her purposes, waiting for the moment when she could reveal herself fully and set them on the path that would lead to the Age of Stars. Everything was in place. All the pieces were positioned on the board. Ranni had waited centuries for this moment, had planned and prepared and sacrificed so much to get here. Now she just needed her chosen champion to navigate the challenges ahead, to prove themselves capable of reaching the end of her quest. The night that shattered everything had set events in motion, but the ending of that night's story was still to be written, and Ranni intended to be the one holding the pen, the Tarnished and the quest. When the Tarnished finally made their way to Carian Manor, fighting through the hand monsters and the sorcerers, and finally defeating Loretta at the top of the estate, they found 3 tall towers waiting for them. Ranni's Rise stood at the centre, and at its peak they met Ranni the Witch for the second time. She greeted them with riddles and poetry, her speech filled with archaic language and metaphors that made her intentions unclear. This was deliberate, of course. Ranni never revealed everything she was thinking, never laid out her plans completely. She spoke in ways that suggested much while confirming little, leaving her true motivations obscure even to those who served her. She offered the Tarnished a choice. They could enter her service, become her champion, help her achieve goals she described only vaguely. In exchange, she would provide knowledge, guidance, and eventually rewards that would make the Tarnished's journey toward becoming Elden Lord easier. It was a transactional relationship phrased in terms of mutual benefit, though Ranni held most of the cards and knew far more about what she was asking than the Tarnished could possibly understand at that point. If the Tarnished agreed to serve her, Ranni would introduce them to her other followers. Spectral forms of Blaidd, Iji and Seluvis would appear in Ranni's Rise, each offering their own perspectives and advice. Blaidd spoke of loyalty and duty, his devotion to Ranni clear in every word. Iji offered practical counsel and crafting services, his wisdom tempered by centuries of experience. Seluvis spoke in condescending tones, treating the Tarnished as a pawn to be used, his true agenda involving experiments with puppet magic that he kept mostly hidden. Ranni's first task for the Tarnished seemed simple enough. She wanted them to retrieve the hidden treasure of Nokron, the Eternal City. She didn't explicitly say what that treasure was, didn't reveal that it was the Fingerslayer Blaidd or explain why she needed it. She simply told them that Nokron held something she required, and she needed someone capable of navigating the Eternal City to retrieve it for her. But there was a problem, as Blaidd would explain when the Tarnished sought his advice. Nokron was inaccessible. The Eternal City was buried deep underground, sealed away by the Greater Will's punishment, and no one had found a way inside in living memory. The path to Nokron was blocked, and no amount of searching or exploration would reveal an entrance that didn't exist. The solution, as Ranni and her followers knew, lay in the stars. When the stars fell, when the celestial order was disrupted, Nokron's entrance would be revealed. But the stars couldn't fall as long as Radahn held them back with his gravity magic, which meant the first step in Ranni's quest was actually defeating Star Scourge Radahn, the demigod who had once been her brother but was now a mad beast roaming the wastes of Caelid. Blaidd told the Tarnished about Redmane Castle, Radahn's fortress in Caelid, where a festival was being organised. The Radahn Festival was a gathering of warriors from across the lands between, all coming together for one purpose: to give the mighty general an honourable death. Radahn had been reduced to madness by the Scarlet Rot, wandering Caelid as a mindless beast, but he had once been a great general beloved by his soldiers. The festival was a way to honour his memory while putting an end to his suffering, but it served Ranni's purposes perfectly. The festival would gather powerful warriors, would coordinate an assault on Radahn that had a chance of succeeding where individual attempts would fail. And if the Tarnished participated in this festival, fought alongside Blaidd and the other warriors, they might be able to defeat Radahn and cause the stars to fall. The Tarnished made their way to Caelid, that horrible rotted wasteland where the very ground was sick and the sky glowed with an unhealthy red light. They reached Redmane Castle and participated in the Radahn Festival, fighting in the Wailing Dunes against one of the mightiest warriors the lands between had ever produced. The battle against Radahn was legendary, even reduced to madness, even infected with rot that was eating him from the inside. Radahn fought with devastating power. He wielded massive greatswords, controlled gravity to crush his enemies, called down meteors from the sky to devastate the battlefield. And through it all, he rode his tiny horse Leonard, the beloved steed he had learned gravity magic to continue riding, using that same magic to keep his massive weight from crushing the horse he loved. Blaidd fought alongside the Tarnished in that battle, proving his worth as a warrior, honouring his connection to Radahn despite fighting against him. Other warriors participated as well, each contributing to the effort to bring down the Star Scourge, and eventually, through coordination and determination and sheer stubborn refusal to give up, Radahn fell. His death was both tragic and merciful. The mighty general who had held back the stars, who had loved his horse and his soldiers, who had been a legend among the demigods, was finally freed from the madness that had consumed him. And with his death, his grip on the stars finally failed. A massive meteor fell from the sky, crashing into Limgrave in the Mistwood region. The impact created a crater that broke through layers of earth and stone, revealing passages that led down, down, down into the depths. And at the bottom of those passages lay Nokron, the Eternal City, finally accessible after centuries of being sealed away. The Tarnished descended into Nokron and found a city frozen in time. The architecture was unlike anything in the surface world. Elegant structures built by the Nox people who had worshipped the stars and the night. Strange creatures inhabited the city, including the mimic Tears, beings that could copy the form and abilities of anyone who approached them, creating perfect duplicates that fought with all the skills and weapons of the original. The Tarnished fought their way through Nokron, navigating its ruins and battling its guardians, and eventually, in a chapel-like structure at the city's edge, beneath a massive hooded skeleton that sat in a chair like a throne, they found a chest. Inside that chest was the Fingerslayer blade, the blood-drenched fetish that was proof of the Nox people's treason, the weapon capable of harming the Greater Will and its vassals. The Tarnished brought the blade back to Ranni, delivering it to her at Ranni's rise. She accepted it with quiet satisfaction, perhaps the closest thing to genuine emotion she had shown since meeting the Tarnished. This was what she had waited centuries for, the tool she needed to complete the next phase of her plan. With the Fingerslayer blade, she could finally kill her two fingers, could sever the last connection between herself and the Greater Will. But before she could do that, she needed to prepare. She gave the Tarnished the Carian inverted statue, an artifact that could be used at the Carian study hall to flip the entire building upside down, revealing a path to the divine tower of Liurnia. She told them to go there, to ascend the tower, though she didn't fully explain why. This was typical of Ranni, revealing only what was necessary, keeping her ultimate goals obscure even to those who served her. The Tarnished did as she instructed, using the statue to invert the Carian study hall and climbing to the divine tower of Liurnia. At the top they found a complex mechanism connected to the cosmos, a way of reading the stars and understanding the fate that had been laid out for Empyreans. Ranni appeared there in spiritual form. Her consciousness travelling through means the Tarnished couldn't understand, and she gazed upon the mechanisms of her own destiny. With the Fingerslayer blade in her possession and her understanding of her fate clarified, Ranni was ready to make her move. She thanked the Tarnished for their service and then departed, heading to the location where her two fingers waited. She was going to kill them, to sever the last connection between herself and the Greater Will's plans for her. And after that, she would need to complete the final stages of her quest to reach the place where she could ascend to godhood on her own terms and create the Age of Stars she had envisioned. But Ranni knew what killing her two fingers would trigger. She knew that Blaidd, her faithful shadow, her beloved stepbrother, would be driven mad by the failsafe built into his very being. She knew that he would either turn on her or die in the struggle to resist. This was the price of her freedom, the cost she had always known she would have to pay, and she was willing to pay it, just as she had been willing to pay every other price her rebellion demanded. The Tarnished, meanwhile, was given new instructions. Ranni left behind a miniature doll, a tiny version of her puppet body, at Renna's rise. The seal on that tower had finally opened, revealing a teleporter that led to Astel River, another underground region. The Tarnished was to go there, to pick up the miniature doll, and to continue following the path Ranni had laid out. As the Tarnished descended deeper into the underground realms, travelling through Astel River toward Nokstella, another eternal city, they carried the miniature doll with them, and if they rested at sites of grace and spoke to the doll, they would hear Ranni's voice emanating from it. She was using the miniature as a vessel for her consciousness, a way to communicate with the Tarnished even though her actual body was elsewhere, dealing with her two fingers and preparing for the final stages of her plan. Through the miniature, Ranni gave the Tarnished their next task. There was something called a baleful shadow that needed to be defeated, an assassin sent by the two fingers to stop her. This shadow took Blaidd's form, appearing as a dark version of her faithful wolf, though it wasn't actually Blaidd himself. It was a tool of the greater will, a weapon sent to eliminate Ranni now that she had moved openly against the cosmic order. The Tarnished found and defeated this baleful shadow, proving once again their worth as Ranni's champion. After its defeat, the miniature Ranni gave them a key, the discarded palace key, which could be used to open a locked chest at the Raya Lucaria Grand Library, where the Tarnished had once fought Rennala. Inside that chest was the Dark Moon Ring, a symbol of a cold oath, a ring that represented Ranni's commitment to her path and her willingness to take a consort for her journey into godhood. This ring was crucial to the next phase of her plan. The Tarnished would need to bring it to Ranni's physical body wherever that was hidden, and present it to her as proof of their dedication to her cause. But first, they needed to find her, and that would require descending even deeper into the underground, passing through the Lake of Rot, one of the most dangerous and inhospitable regions in all the lands between, to reach the place where Ranni's true form waited, betrayal and loyalty. While the Tarnished was navigating the underground passages and following Ranni's instructions, something terrible was happening at the Three Sisters. The failsafe that had been built into Blaidd from the moment of his creation was finally activating. Ranni had killed her two fingers with the Fingerslayer blade, had severed the last connection between herself and the Greater Will's plans, and that act of rebellion triggered the response that Blaidd had always been designed to execute. War Counselor Iji had known this would happen. He had understood for a long time that Blaidd's devotion to Ranni, as beautiful and genuine as it was, would ultimately become a curse. The shadow of an Empyrean was designed to be the perfect failsafe. If the Empyrean remained obedient to the greater will, the shadow would protect them loyally. But if the Empyrean rebelled, the shadow would be driven mad, their loyalty twisting into an obsessive need to attack the very person they had sworn to protect. Iji had tried to prevent this. Before Ranni made her final move against the two fingers, before she killed them with the Fingerslayer blade, Iji had imprisoned Blaidd in an Evergale, the Forlorn Hound. Evergale specifically, a magical prison designed to contain dangerous beings. Iji hoped that by sealing Blaidd away before the madness took hold, he might spare the Wolfman from the worst of his fate. It was a mercy in Iji's mind. Blaidd wouldn't have to experience the horror of turning against Ranni, wouldn't have to feel his mind being overwritten by the compulsion to attack the one he loved most. He would be safely imprisoned, held in stasis, until after Ranni had completed her plans and the danger had passed. It was meant to protect both Blaidd and Ranni, to spare them both from the tragedy that the two fingers had built into their relationship from the beginning. But Blaidd didn't understand. When he found himself imprisoned, when he realized Iji had sealed him in an Evergale, he was confused and hurt. He couldn't comprehend why Iji would do this, couldn't understand what danger he could possibly pose to Lady Ranni. He was part of her very being, her shadow, incapable of treachery. At least that's what he believed. He didn't know about the failsafe, didn't understand that the very loyalty he felt so deeply could be corrupted and turned against him. If the Tarnished encountered Blaidd in the Evergale during their journey, they would hear the confusion in his voice, the genuine bewilderment at being imprisoned by someone he considered a friend. And if they chose to free him, Blaidd would thank them and immediately set out to find Ranni, to ensure she was safe, to fulfill his duty as her protector, despite not understanding why Iji had thought he needed to be contained. But freeing Blaidd only accelerated the tragedy. Or perhaps it made no difference at all, because the madness was already taking hold, was already eating away at his sanity, whether he was imprisoned or free. The compulsion to turn on Ranni was too strong, built too deeply into his fundamental nature to be resisted for long. By the time the Tarnished returned from the underground, having defeated the baleful shadow and retrieved the dark moon ring, Blaidd's transformation was nearly complete. The Wolfman had returned to the Three Sisters, to the area around Ranni's rise, and there he had encountered Black Knife assassins. These were the same assassins Ranni had used for the Night of Black Knives, the Numen women who had been hired to kill Godwyn, and whose daggers had been imbued with the Rune of Death. What they were doing at the Three Sisters is a matter of some debate. Some believe Ranni sent them to kill Blaidd, knowing what was coming and wanting to spare him from complete madness by giving him a quick death. Others think the assassins were operating independently, perhaps sent by forces that wanted to stop Ranni now that she had moved openly against the greater will. Either way, they attacked Blaidd at the base of Ranni's rise. Blaidd killed them all. The corpses of Black Knife assassins littered the ground around the tower, their blood staining the stones, their weapons scattered where they had fallen. Blaidd had fought with desperate fury, his combat prowess overwhelming even these elite killers. He had defended his lady's tower against all threats, had fulfilled his duty as her shadow one final time. But the fight had pushed him over the edge. The madness that had been building in his mind finally consumed him completely. When the Tarnished arrived at Ranni's rise after completing their tasks in the underground, they found Blaidd standing among the corpses, muttering to himself, his words reflecting the internal struggle that was tearing his mind apart. He kept insisting he could never betray Ranni, that he was part of her very being, her shadow, incapable of turning against her. But even as he said these words, even as he clung to his devotion with every fragment of will he had left, the compulsion was overwhelming him. The failsafe built into his nature was rewriting his loyalty, transforming it from protection into threat, changing the love he felt for Ranni into an obsessive need to attack her. And then he attacked the Tarnished, not because he wanted to, not because he chose to, but because the madness had taken over completely. The Greater Will's programming had won. Blaidd, the loyal shadow who had sworn to serve no master but Ranni, who had defied his destiny to remain faithful to her, who had held out against the compulsion longer than any shadow should have been able to, finally succumbed to forces he couldn't resist. The fight was heartbreaking. This wasn't some random enemy or evil villain. This was Blaidd, who had fought alongside the Tarnished against Radahn, who had offered advice and friendship, who had been nothing but helpful and honourable throughout their journey, and now the Tarnished had to kill him, had to put down this loyal warrior who had been destroyed by the very forces he had tried to defy. Blaidd fought with all his considerable skill, wielding his royal greatsword with the same prowess he had always shown. But the madness had made him reckless, had stripped away the tactical thinking that normally guided his combat. He was operating on pure instinct and programming, no longer the thinking being he had been. And eventually, inevitably, he fell. His death was perhaps the saddest moment in all of Ranni's quest. This was the wolf who had known her since childhood, who had been her stepbrother and protector, who had loved her more than he loved his own existence. And he died alone, far from Ranni, consumed by madness, forced to attack the very people he had considered allies. He died not because he chose evil or because he deserved death, but because forces beyond his control had destroyed him from the inside. When War Counselor Iji learned what had happened, he was devastated. He blamed himself for Blaidd's fate, for failing to protect him, for making a grave misjudgment about what could be done to spare the wolf from his destiny. Iji had thought that imprisoning Blaidd would be mercy, but in the end it had made no difference. The failsafe had activated anyway, and Blaidd had died just as horribly as Iji had feared. Iji's grief was profound. He spoke of hoping to apologize to Blaidd when they met again, of accepting responsibility for his failure as a war counselor. He had lost his friend, and nothing about Ranni's success could erase that loss or make it worthwhile. The cost of freedom, for Blaidd at least, had been everything. And Ranni? We don't know how she felt about Blaidd's death. She never spoke of it directly, never expressed grief or regret where the tarnished could hear. Perhaps she mourned in private. Perhaps she had hardened herself against such feelings, had accepted from the beginning that Blaidd's death was necessary for her rebellion. Perhaps she felt nothing at all, having discarded her capacity for genuine emotion in her pursuit of godhood. But Blaidd's armour and weapons remained where he fell, and the tarnished could claim them if they chose. The armour description mentioned that the cold bothered Blaidd anyway, an acknowledgement that he had endured discomfort for Ranni's sake, that his loyalty extended even to suffering things he would rather not suffer. It was a small detail, but it highlighted the depth of Blaidd's devotion and made his death even more tragic. The tragedy of Blaidd wasn't just his death, it was what his death represented. It proved that the greater will's control extended even beyond an Empyrean's rebellion, that the cosmic forces governing the lands between had planned for the possibility of resistance and had built in safeguards to punish it. Blaidd's entire existence had been weaponized against Ranni, his loyalty turned into a curse, his devotion made into the very instrument of his destruction. And Ranni had known this would happen. She had understood from the beginning that Blaidd would be destroyed by her rebellion, and she had done it anyway, had pursued her freedom knowing that the price would be paid in the life of someone who loved her unconditionally. This was perhaps the clearest indication of Ranni's true character. She valued her freedom more than she valued Blaidd's life. Her autonomy was worth more to her than her relationship with the faithful shadow who had been by her side since childhood. Was she wrong to make that choice? The question has no easy answer. Blaidd's life was his own, and he deserved to live it free from the compulsion that killed him. But Ranni's life was also her own, and she deserved to be free from the destiny others had chosen for her. The tragedy is that these two freedoms were incompatible, that the greater will had designed things so that Ranni couldn't be free without Blaidd being destroyed. In a different world with a different system, maybe both of them could have been free. Maybe Blaidd could have remained Ranni's loyal companion without the fail-safe hanging over both their heads like a sword waiting to drop. Maybe Ranni could have pursued her vision without sacrificing everyone around her. But they didn't live in that world. They lived in the lands between, where the greater will's control ran deep, where rebellion demanded blood, where freedom came at prices that sometimes seemed too high to pay. Blaidd's death ensured that the Tarnished would never forget the cost of following Ranni. Every time they looked at his armour or his sword, every time they remembered the wolf who had fought beside them against Radahn, they would be reminded that Ranni's Age of Stars was built on the graves of those who had loved her. Whether that made her vision less worthy, or simply more honest about the price of change, was something each person would have to decide for themselves. But the quest wasn't over. Blaidd's death was tragic, but it was also necessary for Ranni's plans to proceed. With her 2 fingers dead, and her shadow no longer a threat, Ranni could finally complete her ascension. The Tarnished still had tasks to complete, places to reach, dangers to overcome. The Age of Stars was within reach, but only if the journey continued to its end. And that journey led through some of the most inhospitable places in all the lands between, to confrontations with cosmic horrors and ancient evils, to a final meeting with Ranni's true body, and the revelation of what she had been planning all along. The Age of Stars. The journey through the Lake of Rot was a trial unlike any other the Tarnished had faced. This wasn't just a dangerous region filled with powerful enemies. This was a place that actively killed anyone who entered it. A sea of toxic rot that inflicted deadly build-up on anyone who touched its surface. The only way across was by carefully navigating stone platforms that rose just above the rot level, moving from one to the next while defending against the creatures that inhabited this horrible place. The kindred of rot, strange shrimp-like creatures corrupted by the scarlet rot, attacked from the platforms and from the rot itself. They were dangerous, but the real threat was the environment. If you fell into the rot, if you stayed in it for too long, if you couldn't reach the next platform before the build-up meter filled, you would die. The Lake of Rot didn't care how powerful you were, or what armor you wore, or what strategies you had developed. Touch the rot, and you suffered. Stay in it, and you died. But beyond the Lake of Rot, past the nightmare of navigating that toxic sea, lay the Grand Cloister, and beyond that, a passage to the surface. Well, not quite the surface. To a place between underground and above ground, a transition space where the boundaries between realms became blurred. And at the edge of this space, sitting in a coffin, the Tarnished found a way to transport themselves to a boss chamber. The boss they faced there was Astel, natural born of the void. This creature was cosmic horror made manifest, a being that seemed to have come from the spaces between stars, from the void itself. It had a massive segmented body, a skull-like head covered in crystalline growths, and attacks that manipulated gravity and darkness. It could teleport, could grab victims with enormous pincers, could summon meteors from nowhere, could create explosions of void energy that tore through armor and flesh alike. Defeating Astel was a test of everything the Tarnished had learned on their journey. The creature was fast, unpredictable, and devastatingly powerful. Its attacks could kill in seconds if you weren't careful, and the arena provided little room to maneuver. But through persistence and skill, and the stubborn refusal to give up that defined all Tarnished, the cosmic horror was eventually defeated. Beyond Astel's chamber, a seal that had been blocking further progress suddenly opened. The dark moon ring in the Tarnished's possession resonated with something beyond that seal, allowing passage where none had been possible before. An elevator led upward, carrying the Tarnished to a place that existed outside normal geography. This was the Moonlight Altar, a region that sat high above the rest of Liurnia, accessible only through this hidden route or through specific late-game circumstances. The landscape here was ethereal and beautiful, bathed in moonlight that came from sources the Tarnished couldn't quite identify. Spectral forms of animals wandered peaceful grounds. The air itself seemed charged with magic and possibility. And at the far end of the Moonlight Altar stood the Cathedral of Manus Celes, a massive structure dedicated to the moon and the stars. A dragon guarded the approach, but it was optional to fight. The cathedral itself was what mattered, and inside the Tarnished found a hole in the floor leading down to a hidden chamber. In that chamber, sitting on the corpse of her 2 fingers, was Ranni. Not the miniature doll the Tarnished had been carrying, not a projection or a spirit. This was Ranni's actual doll body, her true physical form, the puppet she had inhabited since killing her Empyrean flesh all those centuries ago. She sat motionless, seemingly inanimate, her eyes closed, looking for all the world like a doll that had been abandoned. The corpse she sat upon was disturbing to behold. The 2 fingers that had been assigned to guide Ranni's destiny as an Empyrean had been sliced to pieces, their strange flesh cut and mutilated, their deaths clearly violent and deliberate. This was the culmination of Ranni's rebellion, the physical evidence of her severing all ties to the greater will. She had killed her 2 fingers with the Fingerslayer blade, had destroyed the last connection between herself and the cosmic forces that wanted to control her fate. The Tarnished approached Ranni's still form and, following the instructions they had been given, placed the dark moon ring on her finger. The ring fit perfectly, as it was always meant to. This was a ring depicting a leaden full moon, symbolic of a cold oath, designed to be given by Lunar Princess Ranni to her consort, and by accepting this ring, by placing it on her finger, the Tarnished was agreeing to become that consort, to accompany Ranni into whatever came next. As soon as the ring was in place, Ranni stirred. Her eyes opened, revealing the cold blue glow that characterized her puppet form. She looked at the Tarnished, and for perhaps the first time in their interactions, there was something approaching genuine warmth in her expression. She thanked them for becoming her champion, for following her to the end of this dark path, for accepting the role of her consort. And then she explained what she had been planning all along. Ranni didn't just want to rebel against the greater will. She wanted to remove the influence of all outer gods from the lands between entirely. She wanted to create an age where people could live their lives without divine interference, without cosmic forces manipulating their fates, without gods demanding worship and obedience. She called this the Age of Stars. In Ranni's vision, the gods would depart from the world. They would take their influence, their power, their demands, and they would leave. The moon and the stars would remain, distant and beautiful, but they would not interfere in mortal affairs. People would be free to make their own choices, to create their own destinies, to live without the weight of divine will pressing down on them from above. It sounded beautiful. It sounded like exactly the kind of freedom that the lands between needed after centuries of oppression under the Golden Order and decades of chaos during the shattering. No more gods deciding what people should do or who should rule or what constitutes a life worth living. Just mortals figuring things out for themselves, making mistakes and learning from them, building civilizations without divine blueprints telling them how everything must be. But there was a cost to this vision, and Ranni was honest about it. To create the Age of Stars, she would need to leave the lands between entirely. She would take herself and her order and depart for a journey of 1,000 years into the cold dark of space. She would be gone, unreachable, as distant as the stars themselves. The world would be free, but it would also be alone, without any divine guidance or protection or intervention. The Tarnished would accompany her on this journey. As her consort, as her champion, they would leave the lands between behind and travel with Ranni into the cosmos. They would not be there to guide the world they freed, would not be around to help mortals navigate the challenges of living without gods. They would simply create the conditions for freedom and then depart, trusting that people could figure out the rest on their own. This was Ranni's ultimate vision. Not to replace one tyranny with another, not to become a new god ruling over the lands between with slightly different principles, but to remove godhood itself from the equation. To say that the age of divine rule was over, that mortals deserve the chance to govern themselves, to make their own mistakes and achievements without cosmic oversight. Whether this was wisdom or abandonment, liberation or neglect, was a question without a clear answer. Ranni believed she was giving the world the greatest gift possible: freedom from interference, the chance to be truly autonomous. Critics might argue she was simply running away, leaving mortals to deal with the mess she had created without any guidance or support. Both perspectives had merit. After explaining her vision, Ranni's consciousness departed her dull body. She left behind the dark moon great sword, a massive blade imbued with cold magic and the power of her dark moon. This was her gift to the Tarnished, the weapon that represented her power and her commitment. It was a legendary sword, one that had appeared in other worlds and other stories, always associated with moonlight and sorcery and characters who walked paths between light and darkness. The Tarnished claimed the sword and emerged from the cathedral. Ranni's quest was complete, or at least the part of it that required action in the lands between. The final step would come later, after the Tarnished had completed their own journey to become Elden Lord, after they had defeated the final boss and claimed the right to remake the world. At that point, when the Tarnished stood before the broken remains of Queen Marika and the shattered Elden Ring, they would have choices. They could repair the ring and become Elden Lord in the traditional sense, maintaining some version of the existing order. They could use one of the other mending runes they had collected to create different variations of the Age of the Erd Tree. They could embrace the frenzied flame and burn everything to ash. Or they could summon Ranni. A blue summon sign would appear near Marika's remains if Ranni's quest had been completed. Interacting with that sign would bring Ranni back, fully realized, ready to enact her Age of Stars. And if the Tarnished chose this option, if they committed to Ranni's vision completely, they would see the ending she had planned. The ending was beautiful and melancholy. The Tarnished and Ranni stood together before the broken world, and Ranni spoke of the journey they would take. 1,000-year voyage into the cold dark of space, departing from the lands between, taking the order of the gods with them, and leaving mortals free to determine their own fates. The moon rose in the sky, cold and distant and beautiful, a symbol of the freedom Ranni was granting and the loneliness that freedom would bring. And then they departed, leaving the lands between behind, The Age of Stars had begun. The age of divine interference was over. What would happen next? How mortals would handle their newfound autonomy, whether they would thrive or destroy themselves, was unknowable. Ranni and the Tarnished would not be there to see it. They would be among the stars, unreachable and distant, watching perhaps but no longer interfering. This was Ranni's gift to the world: freedom and solitude, autonomy and uncertainty, the chance to be truly self-determining and all the risks that came with it. Whether this was the best ending for the lands between, whether Ranni was a hero or a villain, whether her vision was noble or cruel, these were questions each person had to answer for themselves based on their own values and priorities. But one thing was certain: Ranni had achieved what she set out to do. She had escaped the destiny the greater will chose for her. She had freed herself from the chains that bound all Empyreans to serve cosmic forces beyond their control. And in doing so, she had shattered the world and then offered to remake it in a way that prioritized freedom over stability, autonomy over order, the right to choose over the comfort of divine guidance. The night that shattered everything had reached its conclusion. The witch who had orchestrated that night, who had killed her brother and herself to escape her fate, who had waited centuries while the world burned, who had sacrificed everyone around her to achieve her vision, had finally completed her plan. The Age of Stars had arrived, and whether the world would be better for it was something only time could tell. The Witch's legacy. As we come to the end of Ranni's story, we're left with complicated feelings and difficult questions. Because Ranni is neither simply a hero nor simply a villain, she's something more complex, something that resists easy categorization or moral judgment. She's a character whose actions shaped the entire world of Elden Ring, for better and worse, and understanding her means grappling with contradictions that don't have clean resolutions. On one hand, Ranni was a rebel against genuine tyranny. The greater will treated Empyreans as vessels, as tools to be used for cosmic purposes, without regard for their own desires or agency. Being chosen as an Empyrean meant having your entire life planned out by forces beyond your control, meant being groomed from birth to serve purposes you never agreed to, meant having your autonomy stripped away in favour of divine will. Ranni was right to resist this. She had every right to want freedom, to reject a destiny imposed upon her without her consent, and the Golden Order, while it brought stability and peace, was also oppressive in its own ways. It persecuted those it deemed impure, cast out the Omen and the Misbegotten and the Albinorics, maintained hierarchies that kept certain groups in power while crushing others beneath their boots. The system was flawed, cruel to those who didn't fit its narrow definitions of worthiness. The world could have used change, could have benefited from someone challenging the status quo and imagining something different. Ranni's vision of the Age of Stars, where gods would depart and mortals would be free to determine their own fates, had genuine merit. Freedom is valuable, autonomy is important. The right to make your own choices and live with the consequences is fundamental to what it means to be a thinking, feeling being. A world without divine interference, where people had to figure things out for themselves without gods telling them what to do, might genuinely be better than a world where cosmic forces micromanaged every aspect of existence. But the methods Ranni used to achieve her vision and the consequences of her rebellion were catastrophic. The Night of Black Knives wasn't just the assassination of one demigod, it was the catalyst for the shattering, for decades of war between demigods, for the deaths of countless innocent people who had nothing to do with Ranni's struggle for freedom. Soldiers who died in pointless wars, civilians caught in the crossfire, entire communities destroyed by conflicts they never asked to be part of. All of this traced back to Godwyn's death, to Ranni's decision that her freedom was worth any price, and the personal cost was equally terrible. Blaidd, who loved Ranni more than life itself, was destroyed by her rebellion. His death was perhaps the purest tragedy in all of Elden Ring, a loyal soul corrupted and killed by forces he couldn't resist, all because Ranni chose to pursue her freedom knowing what it would do to him. Iji, who grieved for his lost friend. Malenia and Michaela, who suffered because the order that had kept some stability in the world was shattered. Godwyn himself, the beloved prince who was murdered for the crime of being Ranni's stepbrother and being in the right position to serve as her sacrifice. The question at the heart of Ranni's story is whether noble ends can justify terrible means. She wanted freedom, both for herself and ultimately for all mortals. That goal was admirable, but she pursued it through assassination, manipulation, calculated betrayals, and a willingness to sacrifice anyone who stood between her and her vision. She treated people as tools to be used and discarded, as obstacles to be removed or pawns to be positioned. The suffering she caused was real and immense, and no amount of future freedom could undo the past pain. Some will argue that Ranni had no choice, that the system she was rebelling against was so absolute in its control that only extreme measures could break it. The Greater Will had designed things so that Empyreans couldn't easily escape their fate, had built in fail-safes and safeguards to ensure compliance. Perhaps Ranni's methods, harsh as they were the only way to achieve genuine change. Perhaps the cost in lives and suffering was unavoidable if the goal was to free the world from divine tyranny. Others will argue that Ranni's methods betrayed the nobility of her goals. If you're trying to create a world where people have autonomy and freedom, starting by taking away the autonomy and freedom of others, by murdering them, or manipulating them, or sacrificing them for your vision, undermines everything you claim to stand for. Freedom built on corpses isn't really freedom at all. It's just a new form of tyranny wearing different clothes. Both perspectives have merit. The tragedy of Ranni is that she was both right and wrong, both hero and villain, both liberator and destroyer. She saw a genuine problem with the world and tried to fix it, but her solution created new problems, caused new suffering, and left questions about whether the cure was worse than the disease. What's certain is that Ranni achieved what she set out to do. She escaped her destiny as an Empyrean. She freed herself from the Greater Will's control. She created conditions for an age of stars where gods would depart and mortals would govern themselves. Whether the world would be better for this change, whether mortals could handle the freedom she granted them, whether the cost in blood and chaos was worth the potential for future autonomy, these were questions that would be answered only by future generations living in the world she created. Ranni's legacy is complicated. She will be remembered as the one who orchestrated the Night of Black Knives, who caused the shattering, who broke the Golden Order and plunged the world into chaos. But she will also be remembered as the one who freed the world from divine interference, who gave mortals the chance to determine their own fates, who valued freedom enough to sacrifice everything for it. Whether she deserves to be celebrated or condemned, whether her story is one of heroism or villainy, whether the Age of Stars is a gift or a curse, these are questions that don't have definitive answers. Different people, with different values and priorities, will reach different conclusions, and perhaps that's appropriate for a character as complex and contradictory as Ranni the Witch. In the end, Ranni did what she believed was necessary. She paid prices and demanded that others pay prices too. She shattered the world and then offered to remake it according to her vision. And now, with her quest complete and her Age of Stars begun, the consequences of her choices will echo through the lands between for generations to come. The night that shattered everything truly shattered everything, and the witch who orchestrated that night departed for a 1,000-year journey among the stars, leaving the world she freed to figure out what came next. Whether that world will thank her or curse her name, whether her vision will prove wise or foolish, whether the freedom she granted will lead to flourishing or disaster, only time will tell. But for now, as we close this chapter of her story, we can at least understand who Ranni was and what she was trying to do. We can see the tragedy and the triumph, the cruelty and the compassion, the sacrifice and the selfishness that defined her character. We can appreciate the complexity of a witch who wanted freedom so badly that she was willing to burn the world to achieve it. And we can recognize that in the lands between, where gods and monsters fought for control of reality, where cosmic forces shaped mortal lives, where destiny seemed inescapable and fate was written in the stars, Ranni proved that it was possible to say no, to reject the path others chose for you, to fight for autonomy even when the cost was terrible, to believe that freedom was worth any price. Whether you agree with her or not, whether you think she was right or wrong, whether you choose her ending or reject it in favour of another path, Ranni the Witch will remain one of the most fascinating characters in Elden Ring. The princess who became a witch, who killed her brother and herself, who shattered the world and then offered to remake it, who loved freedom more than anything else and pursued it with unwavering determination no matter what it cost. The night that shattered everything was her night, and the Age of Stars is her legacy. Whatever comes next for the lands between will be shaped by what she did, by the choices she made, by the freedom she granted and the chaos she unleashed. And somewhere out in the cold dark of space, Ranni and her consort journey on, distant as the stars, watching perhaps but no longer interfering, having given the world what she believed it needed most, the chance to be truly free. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into Ranni's story, if these explorations of the lands between's most complex characters help you drift off to sleep while filling your mind with rich narratives and complicated questions, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories to tell from Elden Ring's world, so many more characters whose tales deserve this kind of attention and analysis. Thank you for listening tonight. Rest well, and remember, sometimes the greatest acts of love and the greatest acts of cruelty look surprisingly similar. Sometimes freedom requires sacrifice. Sometimes the heroes and villains of a story are the same person, viewed from different angles. And sometimes the best we can do is try to understand rather than judge, to appreciate complexity rather than demanding simple answers. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with moonlight and stars. Good night.